Zelensky and his government was basically within 2 hours of getting to Donetsk. My hotel is shelled by artillery, I believe a 155 millimeter artillery shell. It's a NATO standard shell, either coming from a French or a British howitzer. So that is, I got immediately just a small taste of what it's like to live there. Just watched my hotel being hit about 100 meters away from me. I just saw this huge firework kind of explode in front of me. And that was, I was told out afterwards by some of the other people who survived, we're kind of relaxing afterwards, having a drink in this blown up hotel bar. And they said, well, that was your baptism by fire. You survived. Congratulations. Welcome to Donetsk.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite journalists, thought leaders, whistleblowers on to talk about current events, state of affairs, news stories. And this week, something interesting unfolded in the country of Portugal, in the city of Lisbon, where there was a web summit taking place. One of the news organizations that was originally invited to be a part of Web Summit is the Grayzone. When people ask me, can you name a news organization that you can trust, a news organization that you hold in the high regard, I always point to the Grayzone at the top of my list. And so it was interesting this week when they were suddenly disinvited from Web Summit. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion about independent journalism today. Not only do we have Max Blumenthal sitting with us, the founder of the Grayzone, we also have Wyatt Reed, American journalist. You might have seen some of his great reporting that we featured here on the show. So we're going to talk independent journalism, the state of affairs, how hard it is to be independent journalists, or in the face of billionaire mainstream media. So Max, Wyatt, welcome to Redacted. Great to see you guys.
Thanks for having us in studio.
Well, it's an honor to have you guys here. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, we often reference your work here on this show. Our audience knows that we hold you guys in great esteem. And so it's a real honor to have you here. And so I was really disheartened. I was really bothered by this news this week. So I want to start there, and we'll have a wider ranging discussion about independent journalism. What happened at Web Summit? So the Grayzone was invited to come to Lisbon, Portugal, to be a part of Web Summit. Just take me through what happened.
Well, I had no idea what Web Summit was before we were invited, Aaron Mate and myself, to Collision, which is a smaller version of it in Toronto. And there we did a 15-minute kind of panel where we presented mainstream media as the greatest source of disinformation on the planet.
It was a great clip, by the way. We featured it here on the show. I've tweeted about it, and it was like all of the mainstream media people that are sitting in that room when you guys literally destroy them. It was a thing of beauty. It really was.
Yeah, so people loved it, and it was very satisfying for me to have all these mainstream hacks in the front row just nodding their heads and just like going practically having seizures while I spoke. But that clip and the video of us from Collision got 1,000 times more engagement than anything else from there. And so we were invited back to Web Summit, which is the major summit, 70,000 people from the tech industry descending on Lisbon. They call it Davos for geeks or whatever. It's obviously, you have to be there if you are in big tech. And so this conference was sponsored by Amazon, Microsoft, all these bigwigs, the Portuguese government and the Ukrainian government, and lots of Ukrainian techies were there as well. The campaign began to build through the usual NATO-related channels of the Atlantic Council, the NATO's unofficial think tank in Washington, Bellingcat, which is connected to the Atlantic Council, funded by the CIA spinoff, the National Endowment for Democracy, and so on. That's what you saw in public. In private, and I learned this several days ago, the Ukrainian First Lady, the wife of Vladimir Zelensky, NATO's favorite welfare queen, Elena Zelenska, personally lobbied for our disinvitation. And that means that she was threatening major commercial interests saying that they would pull out from this conference unless they disinvited us.
Like sponsors that were a part of it. So they were going to go after sponsors that had funded Web Summit.
One source close to the internal discussions of Web Summit organizers told us she threatened to pull the tablecloth off the table and break everything in the process. And so you have Paddy Cosgrave. He's a significant figure in Ireland. He's sort of a anarchist-minded, he inspired by Julian Assange, but also he's the CEO of this major tech conference. And he has all these employees to pay, all these commercial interests to mind. And he's a great, obviously a Grayzone fan because he invited us. So he chose to continue paying his employees and people and not have his conference be completely wrecked by this government, which is a channel for billions and billions of dollars, not only of military industrial complex money, but also tech money. And then as soon as we were bounced from the conference, you could see Microsoft ink a $100 million deal with the Ukrainian government.
For what?
Tech support for their war, for NATO's proxy war. I mean, this is a high-tech war. Drones, all of that stuff requires tech support. And Microsoft has long been supporting, for example, the Israeli military in its illegal occupation of Palestine. All of the Amazon, I mean, they host the CIA's cloud. They have a $600 million deal to host the cloud of the CIA. That's where the money's coming from for these companies. So we were in the way because we were going to spend 15 minutes explaining what a disaster for European economies this war is and for the people of Russia and Ukraine and the Donbass where Wyatt just was, what a human catastrophe this was. And they could not have that. So at the highest level, and I was mocked for saying this when we were disinvited, I said powerful forces have lobbied to remove us from this conference. People tried mocking me as though it was just the conference organizers decided that we were conspiracy theorists after thoroughly enjoying our content and agreeing with all of it and deciding to invite us not once, but twice. And now we can see who's behind it.
So what specifically, I mean, you can talk about the sourcing there or not, but Zelena, do you know more details about what she might have said and in some of the threats specifically about pulling out? Because she did come then to the conference, right? So she was walking. I think I saw pictures of her walking through the conference and looking at different companies and shaking hands, and everyone was sort of fawning over her.
Yeah, people who went to her speech described it to me as a corporate elevator pitch. I mean, she's just asking for money, support, basically more corporate welfare for their war effort. Military industrial tech welfare for their war effort. But I was told, specifically said that she would denounce the entire conference. And if she did that, then the conference would be seen by these major corporate commercial interests, big tech, as a forum for quote unquote Russian propaganda. And in Europe right now, I mean, we're in Portugal, RT is banned here, like all Russian media is banned. That would have been, the kiss of death. The conference would have unfolded and it would have been a disaster for its chief executive, Paddy Cosgrave, who's kind of like being demonized in the same way that Elon Musk is. He's seen as a disruptor. So yeah, they had to get rid of us. And there's a hilarious aspect to this, which is that every year, the headline speaker, Zelena, was coming in by surprise. The headline speaker hits a red button in a ceremonial gesture launching the Web Summit. She demanded that there be no web button because of the fear of being memed, because it looks so much like a nuclear button and everyone was just going to be.
I mean, to have that awareness, like, okay, we're going to hit this button and that's how we launch Web Summit. No, it could be understood. So they're very aware of just the presentation, right? It's like I should say the theater of it all, right? And Wyatt, you just returned from the Donbass. Are they aware of that there? I mean, the sort of the theater of this war, when you talk to real people who have been affected by the constant shelling over the past 8 years, are they aware of this theater that takes place in the Western world?
People don't really know it's happening. They don't understand it, especially depending on where you are in the Donbass. I mean, I went to villages near the front where people don't have cell phone service. Their news comes via newspaper that arrives once every few days, if they're lucky. People are in a war zone, you know. They're not paying attention to all of this. And in the West, I mean, this is kind of almost the main trajectory of the the battle. It's being fought on the newspapers and the front pages on TV. It's not, that's the main kind of weapon that Zelensky and company have, is propaganda, which is why they were so, I think, frightened by the possibility of being confronted and having that monopoly over the information sphere challenged, even by, Max and Aaron, who don't have a huge mainstream presence. But I think people knew that this would give them some, and they would have to basically legitimize this perspective that's not Russian propaganda. This is a real thing that people feel. So yeah, I mean, this was, to me, they've had this control over the information space for so long. They've totally dependent on it. They've had it in Ukraine since 2014, since the US-backed Maidan coup. They've had just this total monopoly over what people can and can't think. And now they're exporting that to the rest of Europe. And now that has become their domain too. And it's kind of depressing to see so many political leaders just fold. There's no real political leadership in Europe or in the US anymore, for that matter. Nobody to really stand up for the interest of any of these countries. And, it's not surprising to me that so many people in the Donbass see this. They see this, what the West is to them, what it has become, and not surprising to me that basically everyone I talk to on the Russian sympathizing side of the front expressed basically desire to be a part of Russia. They expressed hatred and contempt for the Ukrainian regime. They described them frequently as fascists, as beasts, as people who just want to kill us, because that's their only real interaction with them for the past 8, almost 9 years, is just being on the receiving end of artillery shells. That was my first physical interaction with Zelensky and his government, was basically within 2 hours of getting to Donetsk. My hotel is shelled by artillery, by I believe a 155 millimeter artillery shell. It's a NATO standard shell, either coming from a French or a British howitzer. So that is, I got immediately just a small taste of what it's like to live there. Just watched my hotel being hit about 100 meters away from me. I just saw this huge firework kind of explode in front of me. And that was, I was told out afterwards by some of the other people who survived, we're kind of relaxing afterwards, having a drink in this blown up hotel bar. And they said, well, that was your baptism by fire. You survived. Congratulations. Welcome to Donetsk.
And I saw that on Twitter a short time afterwards, some Western politicians, I think it was Western politicians, saying, well, I wish you would have been there a minute earlier. Like, that's what American politicians think about journalists who are going there and covering the truth, that they wished that you would have been in that bomb blast.
Yeah, that was Dr. Vanessa Enochs. She is a Democratic congressional candidate in Ohio. So this is not some fringe view. This is somebody who is actively participating in a high level of U.S. politics. And this is the level that she's on and the level that we are at now in terms of the discourse, the public conversation. Is just, if you're somehow affiliated with Russia, and because I work for Sputnik News, because it's one of the only news outlets that lets me cover the things that I want to cover, now I'm basically seen as a legitimate target to just be murdered. And there has been no denunciation of this, right?
Right.
Nobody has said, hey, maybe this woman who's running for Congress should apologize. She just deleted the tweet. That's it. They want to bury it up. Nobody's talking about that. We're just in this new world where anything is acceptable. And yeah,
it's just full on information war, and the veneer of democracy is gone.
So as the founder and, running daily the Grayzone, how do you deal with this? I mean, when you were going to speak at Web Summits, for instance, did you have to then submit? Did they ask you to sort of submit a panel topic, what you were going to speak about, for approval before you did? Do you have a much tighter leash because you are the Grayzone, you're independent? If it's somebody from CNN, they're not going to do this, right? They're not going to have they're not going to probably have a pre-approval about it. It'll be, be garbage. It'll be a garbage panel, a waste of time.
No, I mean, the people inviting us knew who we are. They enjoy our content, and you can assume that to some extent they agree with it. Otherwise they wouldn't have invited us, or they wanted us inside the tent to have a wider debate, wider range of views. And so we were going to be able to present our views authentically. But I don't know what we were even expected to do. No one discussed it with me. And me and Aaron Mate, my colleague who's going to be on the panel with me, were wondering what was going to happen. Then we heard that there was some wider panel that we were going to be on with other people who didn't agree with us, and that they were pulling out because, of course, no one will debate us in public face to face because
they don't want to be challenged.
They don't want to get curb stomped. And I mean, they don't have the facts. The average U.S. foreign policy expert at the Atlantic Council, they never even have considered the other side of the debate, what Wyatt has detailed. Like, that's completely foreign to them. And when they're confronted with it, they go into contortion. So that's another factor in our disinvitation, was that people were pulling out from some panel, but we don't even know what panel was planned. I mean, from an organizational standpoint, this was done in an extremely unprofessional manner. And it's something I'm accustomed to from years and years of being deplatformed for my reporting on apartheid Israel, my reporting on the Syrian dirty war. In so many cases, we dealt with deplatforming attempts. And the real goal is not necessarily to ban us per se. Like, I'm allowed to have my website. We're still on YouTube. We're still picking up subscribers there. It's to isolate us from polite society and the mainstream discussion and paint us as some kind of conspiratorial pariahs.
Right. Like, don't invite him to the party. Like, oh, he's crazy. He's one of those guys,
That's
right?
What they did early on to Assange. It was like before they could nail him on some kind of Espionage Act related violation. It was, he is crazy. He's a sexist and he's a rapist. And it kept escalating until they just introduced the secret indictment, because, I mean, the threat that he presented was so much more grave than anything we're doing.
They said he was like smearing his poop on the walls. They said all types of.
Well, that was the final, attempt to brand him as a psycho and destroy his good name within.
Yeah,
I mean, the press could easily create a drumbeat for his release, and
he was the rapist, and then of course the rape charges are that goes away in totally faked, and and now of course you guys covering a lot of what's going on with the intelligence operations with MI6, and of course covering what happened to the Crimean Bridge. We had Kit Clarenberg on the show talking about, of course, that the ties to the British government, and now the grain attacks. So of course they don't want you talking about these things, and I don't see these stories being covered in the mainstream media anywhere.
Well, we teed it up for the British press. I mean, we gave them the raw material to show the British public what British intelligence is doing in their name with their tax money in a foreign theater of conflict to escalate a potentially nuclear war by deliberately crossing Russia's red lines. I mean, the attack on the Kerch Bridge was a deliberate attempt to provoke Russia. It was carried out at least overtly by the Ukrainian SBU security services, a suicide truck bomb attempt. But there are British fingerprints all over this. We at the Grayzone, through Kit Clarenberg, obtained leaked documents from a cell of British military intelligence officials, including an advisor to the British Defense Ministry, of a blueprint for attacking that bridge. The blueprint was put together in April. I interviewed the author of the blueprint. He all but acknowledged putting it together. And while the plan came together slightly differently than they had proposed, there was this postage stamp that the Ukrainian government had put out showing the Kerch Bridge exploding, which looked a lot like this blueprint.
Yeah, almost overnight. Published. Suddenly it's available at the post office in Ukraine. You can go and take your picture with it like a selfie.
Yeah. And so this is a major story. We had like 100,000 hits on the site. I mean, everyone was reading it, and I would assume every foreign correspondent who's interested in this conflict was reading it. And what did the British press do? Just completely ignore it. Amazing discipline from the British media to ignore this. And we've published so many leaks under the byline of Kit Clarenberg. I've shared the byline with him a few times. Leaks on the violation of the Official Secrets Act by Conservative Party elements to manipulate the Brexit vote. Leaks on journalists collaborating with the British security state, specifically Paul Mason, to smear and destroy the Grayzone and other independent outlets, and to destroy the whole Corbynite left in the UK. Amazing stuff. And how did the British press cover it? They never would discuss the content. They would only say, well, this is the result we think of Russian hacking.
Well, they made up an entirely new label on Twitter for this may have been the result of hacked materials to apply specifically to one of your first exposés on Reuters, I believe.
That was amazing. I mean, we got leaks showing that Bellingcat, Reuters, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and BBC Media Action, the charity arm of the BBC, were working with the British Foreign Office, which is the basically parent of the British MI6 secret security service, to infiltrate Russian media and infiltrate Russian media space, to train Russian journalists to be pro-Western, etc. Basically, they were acting as intelligence cutouts. I published on that, and Twitter invented within hours an entirely new label so that anytime anyone shared my article, it said, this may contain material obtained through hacking. So the gamers on Twitter decided, this is funny as hell. Like, let's just take this link and put like a GIF of Alvin and the Chipmunks getting head under it. And then it would say this material obtained through hacking. So the article, thanks to gamers just goofing around with that label, it went completely viral. It was bonkers. It shut down our site like 3 times because we were getting so much traffic that Twitter actually had to remove the label because they realized that they had enacted the Streisand effect on steroids.
I love that. I mean, this speaks to just how difficult it is. I mean, these big media companies through censorship. Then not only that, then you have, of course, you have governments that are actively colluding with these these big tech companies to do it. I want to talk about that because the Intercept this past week published a piece which was really just the tip of the iceberg and left a lot of pieces out of this story about the DHS leaks, these sort of backdoor portals between major tech companies. We covered on the show that really the reporting should have started 2 years ago with Dr. Shiva, whose lawsuit unfolded and uncovered all of this, Gateway Pundit covering it. But the Intercept then suddenly was put up there as, well, they discovered this amazing story, but they left out huge parts of the story. Can you talk about that? When you see, it seems like part of a pattern where they'll release a little bit of information and it covers up the larger part of the story so that the media just kind of moves on from the story. What they really should have been talking about at the Intercept was the funding, like Pierre Omidyar, who is the backer of the Intercept and who also was simultaneously funding these, according to the reports, these operations, these playbooks between big tech companies.
Right.
But that's left out of their story. And so do you see that often in your reporting where there's so-called independent journalists, but they're really controlled by deeper money, bigger money, and they don't get to tell the truth?
Well, Pierre Omidyar's Luminate Foundation is an obvious intelligence cutout that's running all kinds of operations against the main quote unquote competitors of the US, Russia and China. And we've seen the Intercept be transformed from its origins as this radical truth-telling outlet that was going to rely heavily on the Snowden leaks, the NSA leaks, to expose the national security state to essentially becoming an asset itself of the national security state. They just claimed to have obtained all of these leaks from Russia. In other words, a CIA hack and dump operation. They published the Iran leaks, which was essentially used in many ways to justify the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It was all about Iranian infiltration of Iraq and how Iran had done all these horrible things in Iraq under the watch of Soleimani. Where did they get that from? I assume another CIA hack and dump. Where are the Snowden leaks? Where are the Snowden files? They have disappeared. The Intercept is pushing not only...
Well, and the Snowden leaks, they own them, right?
They own this. So they privatized them through Pierre Omidyar, this billionaire oligarch who's very close to the Democratic Party, but also appears to be pretty... I mean, he funded media operations around the Maidan in 2014 to support the US-backed coup in Ukraine, and all across the world he's doing this. So we can assume that he's, at least intelligence adjacent. And so it was always a suspect operation. And the Snowden files were privatized and disappeared. The WikiLeaks puts everything online for us to see. this is gone. I have no idea where these NSA files are. Only 3% ever showed up. The most disgusting thing, one of the most disgusting things the Intercept did was they waited for years until it was no longer relevant to release one of these leaks showing that the Saudi royal family personally authorized an attack on Damascus airport by Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, this fanatical militia that they controlled in Damascus. At a time when, in 2013, 2014, the West was denying that there were even these kinds of Islamist militias at all terrorizing the country. And they waited years and years, and then they gave it to Murtaza Hussein, who supported those militias, who was an open supporter of these al-Qaeda related militias and regime change in Syria. And he spun the whole story. So that's how the Intercept is able to be used to control the narrative. Then finally, Glenn Greenwald turned on them when they refused to allow him to report on Hunter Biden's laptop because Betsy Reed, who makes $1 million a year at The Intercept to produce no content of her own, just happened to be a liberal and didn't want to help Trump. I mean, that's when Twitter banned Trump and it was completely partisan and the whole mask just lifted. So we know what The Intercept is now, but we've been calling it out for years.
Yeah. Wyatt, I wanted to get back to the Donbass here. Yeah. When you're there covering that as a journalist, first of all, you're with Sputnik News. Did they ever come to you and say, we want you to tell a story this way and we want you to have this narrative in a story? Or are you able to do what you want to do and be independent about your journalism?
I have more editorial freedom with Sputnik than I think almost any U.S., especially corporate media journalist would have. I haven't been asked to cover any particular event any particular way ever, really. I get an opportunity. Sometimes they'll ask me to cover a particular topic, but I have more or less total editorial independence.
When you're there in the Donbass, do you see Associated Press reporters? Do you see BBC News reporters? Do you see Reuters reporters wearing helmets?
You don't see any of those. You see a handful of Western journalists. I could count them probably on one hand. I think you and I know at least one or two of them. Eva Bartlett, for example. Right. I got to meet the morning after my hotel was shelled. There are almost no Western reporters, and I'll tell you why. There was a moment that went viral on social media in which a French reporter went to Kherson and started describing live on air what the Ukrainians are doing to the civilian infrastructure. She said they're bombing hospitals, and just a couple seconds later, they just cut her feed completely. They said, we're having connection difficulties. And that was the first and last report I've seen from a Western reporter in any of these areas where there are Russian troops. None of the Western mainstream media outlets will touch it because they know that if they did go to Donetsk, go to the Donbass, there would be nothing else to cover but the reality that the people there have been living through. And so they just don't send them. I managed to find one Al Jazeera reporter, but it was Al Jazeera Arabic. Al Jazeera Arabic, they'll be able to have the freedom, I suppose, to report the reality to their audiences. But Al Jazeera English, no, they won't send anybody. So,
and there are reporters who've been criminalized for being there.
There are reporters like Elena Lip who can't go back to Germany. They face 3 years in prison if they do. So many of us have been placed on...
Simply for reporting from there, she's violated new German speech laws. Graham Phillips
faces criminal... Debanked as well.
Yeah, I myself I'm permanently banned from PayPal. I've been placed on Mirotvorets, which is the Ukrainian government's official or semi-official, depending on how you view it, kill list, hit list. A dozen journalists who've been placed on this list have been murdered, and then they're marked subsequently. Their profile has big red letters placed over their face saying liquidated in Ukrainian. Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher, was recently murdered after being placed on this list. So yeah, it's used officially by border guards to control who can and can't come into the country. And it's been used in hundreds of court cases as evidence of someone having committed a crime. Just the fact that something is listed on this website is apparently considered evidence in Ukrainian court, sufficient enough to convict someone. So it's more or less an official hit list. One of the founders is a man named Anton Gerashenko, who's a top advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. And there are no calls among mainstream media to have this taken down. So this is kind of the environment that people in Ukraine find themselves in. And it's, it has predictable consequences. You don't cover things that you should. You cover them up. You don't cover the perspective of the other side, of the hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the Donbass who don't want to be a part of Ukraine, who view themselves as ethnically or culturally Russian, who don't want to have to go through with all types of things that they described to me personally. I spoke to school teachers and principals who described having to teach since 2014 Holocaust revisionism. They had to teach that the Ukrainian insurgent army were liberators instead of murderers who killed hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles, or they would have lost their job. You don't get a chance to hear any of that, and it's all kind of covered up, hidden, and those of us who are telling the truth about it are marginalized or otherwise silenced.
For the Grayzone, where, if you could wake up and have a dream about where the Grayzone would be and how it would be received around the world, like what would your pie in the sky dream be? I mean, I know I have dreams about what this show can connect people around the world and be, make them aware about topics and things that they might not be aware of. Where do you see the Grayzone going, and what sort of mountain do you have to climb to get it there?
Well, it's not about the Grayzone. It's about the free flow of information and debate.
Right.
In the U.S., as in pretty much every supposed liberal democracy in the West, the third rail is foreign policy or geopolitics, and specifically how power is projected into countries where the West seeks regime change or more power. We can't talk about it. And everything we see and hear in mainstream corporate media, whether it's the New York Times, CNN, BBC, or any of these networks, is determined by the state, and specifically this military intelligence apparatus that forms the PR mechanism that the media, and where the media is simply just a liaison for delivering those messages to the public through these phony personalities that are increasingly discredited. So what we're trying to do is democratize information the same way WikiLeaks did, providing the public with the real story about what their governments and specifically the intelligence services and the military are doing in their name, and presenting the other side of the story that Wyatt is telling of the people on the other side of the gun. Whether it's going to Nicaragua and showing what happened in 2018 when people were terrorized in this Western-backed coup attempt that was presented as this great popular revolution, or going to Venezuela and showing how sanctions are affecting everyday people and how people are resisting them, or giving voice to reporters who are going to the Donbass region to the other side of the gun, or providing a transparency with leaks and original reporting and making phone calls and getting in people's faces in Congress. We're just trying to democratize the flow of information around these issues that are deemed verboten to discuss within mainstream media. So for us, it's not about the Grayzone. It's about the whole media opening up the discussion and giving people this information. Obviously, they won't, because they're afraid of democracy. Samuel Huntington published or co-authored a book in the early 70s called The Crisis of Democracy. And he feared that after the 60s, the public was learning too much about U.S. war making and U.S. foreign policy because of the way the Vietnam War was covered. And he presented prescriptions for de-democratizing American society. And we are just living through the terminal phase of that period right now.
It's trying to bring this knowledge to people is so important. So I want to thank you, Max. I want to thank you, Wyatt, for joining us here. I encourage our audience to go out and read the great reporting at the Grayzone, read what Wyatt's producing and writing at Sputnik and other outlets as well. And try to share this information with people who have been brainwashed and told this narrative since they were babies, basically, by the Western media. So our thanks to you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us in studio, and thanks for what you're doing here.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you, guys. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this conversation. We will see you next time.